Hey, it's Jason, and in this video, I will attempt to make a coffee table out of epoxy, LEDs, and rainbows. That's right, rainbows. Well, not real rainbows, but I bought these little control boards that can make LEDs do crazy things, including this really cool rainbow pattern. So I started by ordering a bunch of parts from Amazon that I thought I would need for this build, which includes a strip of individually addressable 5-volt LED lights. They're individually addressable so I can control the color and the brightness of each one. A 5-volt power source, a bunch of ESP8266 control boards for the LEDs, a bunch of epoxy, and various other knickknacks. I'll have the full list in the description below. I wanted to see what these LEDs actually look like, so here they are connected to the control board. They're honestly pretty cool, and there's hundreds of different animations that I can choose from, all of which is controlled by an app on my phone over Wi-Fi. The plan for this table was to cut a groove in the tabletop where I could recess the LEDs into. Then I was going to cover them with epoxy and have the light shine through the epoxy, which would effectively act as a light diffuser. However, I had no idea how thick the epoxy should be, or what color it should be, or what concentration the color should have. I originally thought I could use a diluted black dye in my epoxy and do a very thin layer. So I did a couple of tests of this and quickly realized that the black was super black and almost no light would penetrate. It was at this point I realized I would need to use a white dye, so I made a couple of samples of varying epoxy thicknesses and concentration of white dye, and I found one that worked pretty well. I needed about a 9mm thick epoxy with a white dye concentration of about 1 drop per 50 milliliters of epoxy. So after mixing up a bunch of samples, I just laid them out on the LED strip just to see what it would look like. I ran it through several different animations, both with the lights on and the lights off, and eventually that's how I found the final sample. Next, I needed to get a tabletop. Given that this was a prototype table, I didn't want to spend too much time making the top itself, so I bought what I thought would be a simple alternative, which was a butcher block countertop, 50 inches by 25 inches from Home Depot. I assumed that it would be perfectly square and flat and reasonably stable right from the factory, but none of these things turned out to be true. I first had to cut off the factory ends to make it square. I then quickly moved into making the grooves for the LEDs. I was on a time crunch here because when I opened the plastic sheathing around the butcher block, there was a big warning saying I needed to finish the wood within 24 hours, presumably because the wood needed to be sealed to prevent any movement. I tried several methods of cutting the groove, which was about 5.5 inches wide, 1/2 inch deep, and the entire length of the table. I first tried my track saw, but this would have taken forever. I then tried to use the dado blades on my table saw, but I could not keep the board flat enough at the ends to actually make a cut of even depth. Then I tried to freehand my router, and this worked okay, at least enough to keep going, but as you'll see later on in this video, I come back and redo this. Okay, now with the groove cut, I could finally seal the wood like the packaging recommended. So I did a coat of this General Finishes water-based polyurethane. I used this because it has virtually no color and I did not want to yellow this birch butcher's block. Now with the top sealed, it was time to move on to setting up the LEDs. One of these LED strips has 150 LEDs, so I figured that if I put 4 rows of LEDs, this would make a nice looking matrix right down the middle of the table. So I used my ruler and made a bunch of marks where the LEDs should go. I then cut the strips and laid them down, but I realized I had messed up pretty bad when I accidentally put a strip facing the wrong way. All right, I just messed up pretty bad. You guys might have saw it in the video when I was putting these LEDs down, but I didn't put the polarity right. So that strip is going that way, and this strip should be going this way. So either I have to redo these 3 strips, or I have to redo this one and drill a hole on that side. I was testing my LED strips, just the first 2 that I actually soldered the connections on. I was testing with the power supply and I just made a really stupid mistake, and I accidentally put the polarity of the voltages backwards, which completely fried my LED strips. So I went and I bought another strip here that I'm gonna put in. But before I do this, I actually want to do something that has been bothering me about this table, and that is I didn't quite get the routing done quite as good as I had hoped. Essentially what happened is when I was routing it out, I didn't have a long enough piece to like support across like the faceplate of the router or whatever it is, support across the gap, so it kind of tilted in some areas, so I made a few gouges. So I want to fix that, and this actually works perfectly because when I was measuring the depth of this, I didn't measure correctly the thickness of the LEDs. So I'm going to route out a little bit more wood because that will add more depth to the epoxy, which will then diffuse the light a little bit more to the correct depth. It's supposed to be about 6.5 millimeters above the LEDs. Right now it's at about 6.5 millimeters in total. And also, after laying these out, I kind of realized that I want a little bit more gap in between here, like the edge of this and that. So I'm actually going to widen this by maybe 1/4 inch. I used a trick I had seen from a guy called Cam on his channel called Blacktail Studio, where he had done something similar. He uses a large acrylic sheet with 2 other guides and a templating router bit to make the groove. So I went to Home Depot and picked up an acrylic sheet and made a large faceplate. This worked like a charm. I had to make the groove a little wider and deeper to cover up my previous mess ups, but this was totally fine because as you'll see in the end, I could have gone even deeper and wider. And yes, I do sometimes work late at night in my pajamas. All right, that was brutal. This idea was definitely better in planning than execution. I bought like my bit for flattening it was like this big, a 1/2 inch, and it just back and forth a million times. And then the bit slipped out a little bit, so I had to go a little bit deeper. It was a nightmare. Power went out halfway through. Oh, and it was on the ground. I was just killing myself. Yeah, you don't really need to think about this one. So this is effectively a router sled, and I need a router sled at some point. So, and a larger servicing bit because that was brutal. Absolutely brutal, but it did work, and it's honestly a really good finish, so I'm super happy with it. So now it's time to redo the LEDs. You'll see me here soldering the control board to the LEDs, which will allow me to control them from my phone. All you need to do to get this to work is to install the WLED app on your phone, install the WLED firmware on the board, and then you can control your LEDs over Wi-Fi. It's honestly pretty slick, and I'll have links to all this stuff in my description. I also soldered all the LEDs together, paying careful attention to the polarity this time, and I got them all working. Okay, everything's soldered, all the connections are made, and I'm about to plug it in. I haven't tested this one yet. Like the last one, I got the polarity wrong and just burnt everything up. So here it is, and I'm gonna show you guys what happens as I plug it in. Hopefully it works better this time. So if you guys hear popping or see smoke, that means I need to redo everything again. Oh, I think it's working. It's only programmed, I think, on the first 30 right now. I have to set it to 150. Oh, it works. Oh my god, it looks so good. Let's do some effects. Oh my god. I'm just gonna play with the different animations. So I've set it now up into a matrix, so it knows that there's 4 rows of 37. Okay, with the LEDs done and tested, it was time to move on to the epoxy. There's a small hole where the LEDs would come through the bottom of the table, and I sealed this with some caulk, which worked pretty well. I then used 2 pieces of wood with resin tape to seal the ends of the groove, and then started preparing the epoxy. The epoxy I decided to use was this Total Bolt thick set, which can cast up to 1 inch thick. I mostly chose this epoxy because I see all the other YouTubers using it. I have no idea if this is any good, and this video is not sponsored in any way, but as you'll see later on, it actually turns out pretty good. I mixed up about 1,500 milliliters of this stuff. I like working with metric when I can because even though I'm American, it's just way easier to do the math. I used about 30 drops of white dye for this mix up, and then after mixing for about 10 minutes, I poured it in. To be honest, I should have just hand mixed this because the mixing paddle did introduce a ton of air bubbles that I had to keep coming back over the next couple hours and popping with a torch. But it was super satisfying. And here I got it all in, but you can see another mistake I made. Those black LED strips and those black wires were just a little bit too visible through the epoxy. In the future tables I plan on building, I'll definitely have to use white wires. So after letting it sit for about a day, I came back because I couldn't wait to test out the LEDs. Epoxy isn't super conductive, but the dye is, and I wasn't sure if it would just shorten immediately when I turned it on. But as you can see, it worked, and it worked really well. I let this cure for about another 2 weeks before unclamping. You don't typically need to let it cure this long, but I was on vacation for a week, so it just worked out like that. So I undid the clamps, removed the wood on each end, and finally had my first good look at it. It was at this point I realized that the tabletop wasn't completely flat, as two things had happened. First, the epoxy wasn't completely flat on the table as it was a little bit high in one spot, and secondly, the wood had cupped just a little bit. It was at this time I realized I was going to have to build a router sled just to flatten this table. I had been wanting to build one for a long time, but I had hoped that I could finish this project first, but nope, I had to build one now. So I did what all you guys are doing right now and went on YouTube and watched a bunch of videos. I originally planned to buy these giant linear rails and build a 4x8 workbench just for flattening, which would have undoubtedly delayed this video by many weeks. But then I found this video of a guy just using 2-inch angle iron. This seems super simple and super compact way to make a router sled, so I whipped one up off camera. If you guys want to see that build, just let me know in the comments. And then I just went to town on the tabletop. I didn't even set up dust collection. And this was a huge mistake that I'll never do again because it was terrible. Immediately after starting to play, there was dust everywhere. But I didn't want to stop now that I was in the middle of it, so I just went ahead and finished it. Immediately afterwards, I just went on Amazon and bought a brand new 3M respirator to help with the dust collection, to help with my lungs, and a larger dust collection hose so I could actually hook it up to the router. Now, after spending the next hour cleaning up my shop, I put an 1/8 inch round over on the edges and then sanded and put 4 coats of that same general finishes on the top. I originally had planned to sand all the way from 80 to 400 grit in increments, so I had bought this combination pack of sandpaper. But when I had got it, it didn't have the Velcro backing that I needed for my Festool sander. So I only got the 220 grit with my existing sandpaper. Not great, and to be honest, the finish could have been better, but this was an experimental table that I was trying to figure out with the epoxies and LEDs and whatnot, so I wasn't too worried. In the future, I'll make sure I sand all the way up to 3000 and buff. Then I attached these legs I bought on Amazon for about $20, soldered and attached the power source, and it was done. Now, if you made it all the way to the end of this video, then I'd like to give you a reward and let you know about the next project I'm making. This rainbow epoxy LED table gave me a lot of ideas, and the next table I'm going to be making is going to be called a starry night table. I'm planning on using these LEDs to mimic the night sky by embedding them in an epoxy table with metallic glitter to make it seem like a night sky on a clear night. If that sounds enticing, then please consider subscribing to get notified when it goes live. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.
So here it is in its final location in the living room, and it honestly looks fantastic. I was really worried it was going to look tacky because LEDs can 100% look tacky, but I think it actually fits fairly well. And just before we wrap up, I do want to share with you the app that I'm using to control this, because there's literally hundreds of different settings I could change on this to make it do pretty much anything I want. So the app I'm using is WLED. It's on the App Store. I think it's like actually WLED native for some reason. But here, check this out. You have all these different options. Like there's hundreds of these. All these different options. And so I've just gone through and found a few of them. The one that's playing right now is called Hypnotic. And yeah, I think you can see why. But there's other ones. So let's just flip through a few of them. Okay, this is Waterfall. This one's pretty cool. Noise Pal, whatever that means. Multi-comment. Some of them are really fast, really slow. You can control kind of like how fast the animation plays or kind of like the color scheme of each of the animation. I'm just using some default ones. And this one here is called Frizzles. Anyway, see you guys in the next one.